Margaret Dawson was a woman of quiet simplicity. At 48 years old, she carried herself with an air of calmness that came from years of living a life without much fuss or fanfare. She wasn't the kind of person who turned heads when she walked into a room. Instead, she blended in, like the soft hum of a refrigerator or the steady ticking of a clock. Her days were predictable, filled with small routines that gave her comfort. Every morning she would wake up early, make a pot of tea, and sit by the window to watch the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Then, after tidying up the house, she'd head out to run errands. On this particular day, Margaret decided to visit the local grocery store. It was one of those ordinary trips she made every week, to buy bread, milk, and whatever else they needed for dinner. She didn't think twice about it as she slipped on her faded jeans and a cardigan that had seen better days. The sweater wasn't fancy, but it kept her warm, and that was all that mattered. Grabbing her reusable shopping bag, she stepped outside and began the short walk to the store. The town where Margaret lived was small enough that everyone seemed to know each other, or at least recognize faces. People greeted her with polite nods as she passed by, though few stopped to chat. Margaret didn't mind. She preferred keeping to herself most of the time. To her, these walks were peaceful, offering a chance to clear her mind and enjoy the crisp autumn air. Leaves crunched underfoot as she strolled along the sidewalk, admiring the trees that were slowly shedding their golden coats. When Margaret arrived at the grocery store, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss welcoming her inside. The familiar scent of fresh produce and baked goods greeted her as she entered, and she smiled faintly. This place held no surprises for her. It was a routine stop, just like so many others before it. She grabbed a cart and began wandering through the aisles, carefully selecting items while keeping an eye on prices. Money was tight these days, and Margaret always tried to stretch their budget as far as possible. As she reached for a can of soup on a lower shelf, something unexpected happened. A stack of canned goods sitting precariously on the edge of the display wobbled and then toppled over. The crash echoed loudly through the aisle, startling nearby shoppers and drawing curious glances. Margaret froze, her hand still hovering near the fallen cans. Her cheeks flushed red as she realized what had happened. "Oh no," she muttered under her breath, bending down quickly to pick up the mess. But before she could finish cleaning up, a young man appeared at the end of the aisle. He wore a name tag that read manager and carried himself with an air of authority that seemed exaggerated for someone so young. His expression was stern as he approached her, arms crossed over his chest. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs of onlookers. "I'm sorry," Margaret said immediately, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't mean to knock them over. I'll clean it up right away." She continued gathering the scattered cans, stacking them neatly back onto the shelf. But the manager didn't seem satisfied. "You need to be more careful," he snapped, his tone dripping with impatience. "This isn't the first time we've had problems with people like you causing disruptions." "People like me?" Margaret repeated, looking up at him with wide eyes. She wasn't sure what he meant by that, but the implication stung. Still, she tried to stay composed. "I really am sorry. It was an accident." The manager shook his head dismissively. "Accidents or not, you're making a scene. Maybe you shouldn't be here if you can't handle things properly." His words hit Margaret like a slap across the face. She felt heat rise in her cheeks again, but this time it wasn't embarrassment. It was hurt. How could someone judge her so harshly based on one tiny mistake? Before she could respond, the manager gestured toward the exit. "Come on, let's go. You can leave now." His tone left no room for argument. Feeling defeated, Margaret abandoned her half-filled cart and followed him to the front of the store. As they passed other customers, she kept her gaze fixed firmly on the floor, too ashamed to meet anyone's eyes. Once outside, the manager gave her a final glare before turning back toward the entrance, leaving her standing alone on the sidewalk. For a moment, Margaret simply stood there, trying to process what had just happened. Her hands trembled as she clutched her empty shopping bag, and tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She had never been treated so rudely in her life. All she had done was accidentally knock over a few cans, yet somehow, it had escalated into this humiliating ordeal. The injustice of it weighed heavily on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Slowly, Margaret started walking away from the store, her steps dragging with exhaustion. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the world had settled onto her shoulders. She replayed the incident in her mind, wondering if there was anything she could have done differently. Had she moved too carelessly? Should she have spoken up more forcefully? Or was it simply impossible to change someone's opinion once they had already judged you? As she turned the corner, putting some distance between herself and the store, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of insignificance that lingered in the pit of her stomach. For years she had lived her life quietly, content to stay in the background while others took center stage. But today, that quiet existence had been thrown into sharp relief, exposing vulnerabilities she hadn't even realized were there. And, as she continued walking home, she wondered if anyone would ever truly see her for who she was, or if she would always remain invisible to the world around her. Margaret's walk home felt longer than usual, each step heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The crisp autumn air that had once seemed refreshing now bit at her cheeks, matching the sting of humiliation she carried inside. Her mind replayed the scene at the grocery store over and over again like a broken record she couldn't turn off. The manager's harsh words echoed in her ears. "Maybe you shouldn't be here if you can't handle things properly." Those words cut deeper than Margaret wanted to admit. She wasn't careless, was she? She had lived her whole life trying to do everything right, keeping the house tidy, managing their tight budget, supporting her husband through his demanding career. Yet today, it felt like none of that mattered. As she walked, Margaret noticed the way people passed her by without a second glance. A young mother pushing a stroller barely acknowledged her presence. A group of teenagers laughed loudly as they crossed the street, completely oblivious to the middle-aged woman trudging along the sidewalk. Even the friendly shopkeeper who usually waved hello from behind his counter didn't look up as she passed by. It was as though she had become invisible. Not just to the manager at the store, but to everyone around her. The thought unsettled her. Margaret had always been content living quietly, staying out of the spotlight. But now, for the first time, she wondered if her quietness had come at a cost. Had she allowed herself to fade into the background so much that no one noticed her anymore? She shook her head, trying to push the idea away. "It doesn't matter," she whispered to herself, though her voice lacked conviction. Still, she kept walking, her pace slowing as fatigue set in. Her thoughts drifted to Richard, her husband. They had been married for 25 years, and while their relationship had its ups and downs, Margaret had always believed they shared a deep bond. Lately, however, things had felt distant. Richard worked long hours at his corporate job, often leaving before dawn and returning late at night. When he was home, he spent most of his time either on phone calls or buried in paperwork. Margaret tried not to take it personally. She knew how hard he worked to provide for them. But sometimes, especially on days like today, she couldn't help but feel lonely. Would Richard even notice she wasn't home? She doubted it. He rarely paid attention to the little details of their daily lives anymore. The meals she prepared, the laundry she folded, the errands she ran. Margaret had grown accustomed to handling everything on her own, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. She wondered if he would care about what had happened at the store, or if he'd dismiss it as unimportant, just like everyone else seemed to. The farther she walked, the more her emotions bubbled to the surface. Anger, sadness, frustration, they all swirled together until Margaret wasn't sure which one to focus on. Part of her wanted to cry, to let the tears flow freely and release the tension building inside her chest. But another part resisted, stubbornly clinging to the idea that crying wouldn't solve anything. So instead, she swallowed her emotions and pressed on, her jaw tightening with determination. By the time she reached the corner near the grocery store, Margaret's legs ached, and her throat was dry from holding back tears. She paused for a moment, leaning against a lamppost to catch her breath. As she stood there, staring blankly at the traffic passing by, something unusual caught her eye. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, its shiny exterior gleaming in the sunlight. Margaret frowned, puzzled. Luxury cars weren't common in their small town, and this one looked out of place among the modest sedans and pickup trucks parked nearby. Her confusion deepened when the tinted window rolled down slowly, revealing a familiar face. It was Richard. For a split second, Margaret thought she might be imagining things. What was Richard doing here? And why was he driving that car? The vehicle belonged to his company. It was reserved for high-profile meetings and special events. He almost never used it for personal errands. "Margaret?" Richard called out, his voice cutting through her shock. His tone was soft but tinged with concern, and his brow furrowed as he studied her face. "What are you doing here? Why aren't you at the store?" Margaret hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She hadn't expected to see Richard, let alone explain the embarrassing incident to him. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw genuine worry, not judgment or irritation, but actual concern for her well-being. Slowly, haltingly, she began to tell him what had happened. She recounted the accident with the cans, the manager's scolding, and the humiliating escort out of the store. Her voice wavered as she spoke, betraying the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. Richard listened silently, his expression growing darker with each word. When she finished, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's unacceptable," he said firmly, his voice low but intense. "No one should treat you that way." Before Margaret could protest or downplay the situation, Richard stepped out of the car. He adjusted his suit jacket, smoothing out imaginary wrinkles, and turned to face her. Extending his hand, he said, "Come with me. We're going back." Margaret blinked, startled. "Back? To the store?" "Yes," Richard replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This isn't okay, Margaret. You deserve better than that." For a moment, Margaret hesitated. The idea of returning to the store filled her with dread. What if the manager was still there? What if others judged her again? But then she looked at Richard's determined expression and felt a flicker of courage stir within her. Maybe she didn't have to face this alone. Maybe, just maybe, standing up for herself with Richard by her side was exactly what she needed to do. Taking a deep breath, Margaret slipped her hand into his. Together they climbed back into the SUV, the engine purring softly as Richard pulled away from the curb. As they drove toward the store, Margaret felt a strange mix of apprehension and hope. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time all day she didn't feel invisible. The drive back to the grocery store was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt awkward or heavy. Instead, it was filled with unspoken understanding, a shared determination between Margaret and Richard to set things right. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring out the window as the familiar streets rolled by. Her heart raced with a mix of emotions. Nervousness about confronting the manager again, relief at having Richard by her side, and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Richard gripped the steering wheel firmly, his jaw set, in a way that suggested he was deep in thought. He glanced at Margaret occasionally, his eyes softening when he noticed how tense she looked. "It's going to be okay," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was calm but firm, like a promise rather than an empty reassurance. Margaret nodded slowly, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Still, there was something comforting about hearing those words from him. It reminded her that she wasn't alone, that someone cared enough to stand up for her. When they arrived at the store, Richard parked the SUV directly in front of the entrance, its polished black exterior gleaming under the afternoon sun. The sight of such an expensive car drew curious glances from passers-by, but neither Margaret nor Richard paid them any attention. Together, they stepped out of the vehicle, their movements synchronized as if they were preparing for battle. Richard straightened his suit jacket one last time before offering Margaret his arm. She hesitated for a moment, then took it, feeling a surge of strength flow through her. With Richard beside her, she felt less like the timid woman who had been humiliated earlier and more like someone ready to reclaim her dignity. As they entered the store, all eyes turned toward them. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the chatter among shoppers faded slightly, replaced by whispers and murmurs. Some people recognized Richard immediately. His face was well known in the community, especially among those who followed local business news. Others simply stared at the couple, intrigued by the contrast between Margaret's modest appearance and Richard's polished demeanor. For once, Margaret didn't feel invisible. If anything, she felt too visible, and for a brief moment she wished she could shrink into the background again, but then she remembered why they were here, to make things right, and squared her shoulders. The young manager who had escorted Margaret out earlier was standing near the customer service desk, chatting casually with a coworker. At first, he didn't notice the commotion caused by Richard and Margaret's arrival. But when the whispers grew louder and heads began turning in his direction, he looked up and froze. His smile faltered as he realized who had just walked in. Recognition dawned on his face, followed quickly by unease. He straightened up instinctively, his posture stiffening as Richard approached with purposeful strides. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. It was polite but commanding, leaving no doubt that he expected immediate attention. The manager swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as he stepped forward. "Can I help you?" he asked, attempting to sound confident despite the obvious discomfort etched across his face. Richard didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I hear my wife was treated poorly here today," he stated bluntly, his tone icy. He gestured toward Margaret, who stood quietly beside him, her expression unreadable. "Is that true?" The manager blinked, clearly caught off guard. He opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, glancing around as if seeking support from his colleagues. When none came, he stammered, "Sir, I don't know what happened. I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Richard repeated, raising an eyebrow. His voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it that made the manager flinch. "Your job is to treat customers with respect, regardless of how they look or what mistakes they might make." Was that the case here? The question hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. The manager shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between Richard and Margaret. Finally, he muttered, "She knocked over some cans, sir." It was disruptive. "She knocked over some cans," Richard echoed, his voice rising slightly. He leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto the manager's. "And because of that, you decided she didn't belong here? You judged her based on her appearance, didn't you? You assumed she wasn't worth your time or respect." The accusation hit its mark. The manager's face flushed red, and he took a step back, visibly shaken. "That's not," he started. But Richard cut him off. "It is what happened," Richard interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You saw her clothes, her shopping bag, and you made assumptions about who she is. But let me tell you something about my wife." He paused, turning slightly to include Margaret in the conversation. His voice softened as he continued. "Margaret has spent her entire life putting others first. She works tirelessly to keep our home running smoothly, manages our finances carefully, and supports me in ways most people wouldn't understand. She doesn't ask for recognition or praise because that's not who she is. But she deserves respect, not just from me, but from everyone she encounters." The crowd that had gathered listened intently, some nodding in agreement while others exchanged guilty glances. The manager looked down at his shoes, unable to meet Richard's gaze. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to offend anyone." Richard crossed his arms over his chest, his expression unwavering. "An apology isn't enough," he said firmly. "This isn't just about my wife. It's about how you treat every customer who walks through these doors. People deserve to be treated with kindness and fairness, no matter what they look like or how much money they have. Do you understand?" The eyes. Manager nodded vigorously, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "Yes, sir, absolutely." "Good," Richard replied, his tone softening slightly. He turned to Margaret, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Margaret nodded. though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She wasn't used to seeing this side of Richard, the protective, assertive man who refused to let anyone mistreat her. It was both surprising and deeply touching. For the first time since the incident, she felt truly seen and valued. Richard addressed the manager one final time. "Make sure this doesn't happen again. And if I hear otherwise." He let the sentence trail off, the implication clear. Then, without waiting for a response, he guided Margaret away from the crowd and toward the exit. As they stepped outside, the tension that had been weighing on Margaret began to lift. The fresh air felt invigorating, and for the first time all day, she allowed herself to take a deep breath. Richard opened the car door for her, his movements gentle and deliberate. Once they were both seated inside, he turned to her and smiled, softly. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Margaret hesitated, then gave him a small, grateful smile. "Better," she admitted. "Thank you for coming back for me." Richard reached over and squeezed her hand. "Always," he said simply. And in that moment, Margaret knew she wasn't invisible anymore, not to Richard and not to herself. After leaving the grocery store, Richard didn't suggest heading straight home. Instead, he turned to Margaret with a thoughtful expression and said, "Let's get lunch." His tone was casual, but there was an underlying seriousness to it, as if he wanted to make sure she wasn't left alone to process everything that had just happened. Margaret hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't accustomed to eating out, especially not at fancy places, and the idea felt indulgent given their modest lifestyle. But before she could protest, Richard added gently, "You deserve it." Margaret nodded slowly, giving in to his suggestion. She trusted Richard, even if this sudden change in his demeanor still felt unfamiliar. As they drove away from the store, the hum of the luxury SUV's engine seemed to echo her racing thoughts. The confrontation with the manager had been intense, and while part of her felt relieved, another part was still reeling. She stared out the window, watching the small-town scenery blur past, her mind replaying snippets of the day, the toppled cans, the manager's harsh words, Richard stepping in like a knight in shining armor. It all felt surreal, as though it had happened to someone else. Richard pulled into the parking lot of one of the nicest restaurants in town, a place Margaret had only ever admired from afar. Its name, the Willow Room, was written in elegant script above the entrance, and the building itself exuded sophistication with its polished stone facade and neatly trimmed hedges. Margaret glanced down at her faded cardigan and jeans, suddenly self-conscious again. She tugged at the hem of her sweater nervously. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not really dressed for—" "You look perfect," Richard interrupted firmly, his eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror. There was no hesitation in his voice, no trace of doubt. "This isn't about what you're wearing. It's about taking care of you. Let's go." His words were simple, but they carried weight. Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself as she stepped out of the car. Together they walked toward the entrance, Richard holding the door open for her as they entered. The interior of the restaurant was just as impressive as the outside. Soft lighting illuminated rich wood paneling, and the air smelled faintly of herbs and freshly baked bread. A hostess greeted them warmly, leading them to a quiet corner table near a large window overlooking a serene garden. As they settled into their seats, Margaret couldn't help but feel out of place. The other diners were dressed in business suits or designer dresses, their conversations flowing effortlessly over glasses of wine. She fidgeted with the napkin on her lap, acutely aware of how different she looked compared to everyone else. But then she glanced at Richard, who seemed completely at ease, flipping through the menu with a relaxed smile. His calmness helped steady her nerves, and she forced herself to focus on the moment rather than her insecurities. When the waiter arrived to take their order, Richard handled most of the interaction, recommending dishes that sounded foreign yet intriguing to Margaret. She listened intently, nodding along as he described each item with enthusiasm. For a man who rarely discussed anything beyond work, Richard's newfound liveliness was refreshing. Once the waiter left, Richard leaned forward slightly, resting, his elbows on the table. "So," he began, his tone light but sincere. "How are you feeling?" Margaret hesitated, unsure of where to start. How did one put into words the whirlwind of emotions she'd experienced today? Finally, she settled on honesty. "Confused," she admitted softly. "Grateful that you came back for me, yes, but also, I don't know. Like maybe I've been letting people treat me a certain way for too long without realizing it." Richard's expression softened and he reached across the table to cover her hand with his own. "That's understandable," he said, "and it's okay to feel that way. What happened today, it shouldn't have happened. Not to you, not to anyone. But I think it can be a turning point if we let it." "A turning point?" Margaret echoed, raising an eyebrow skeptically. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Richard continued, choosing his words carefully, "that maybe it's time we both start paying more attention to each other, to ourselves, to the little things that matter. I've been so focused on work lately that I haven't been the husband I should be. I've taken you for granted, Margaret, and I'm sorry for that. You deserve better." Margaret blinked, caught off guard by his admission. Over the years, she had grown used to Richard's long hours and occasional absences, convincing herself that it was just part of their life together. Hearing him acknowledge it now, however, brought tears to her eyes. She quickly dabbed at them with her napkin, embarrassed by the unexpected wave of emotion. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice thick with gratitude. "That means a lot." Their food arrived shortly after, and as they ate, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Richard shared stories from his early days in the corporate world, funny anecdotes about awkward meetings and misplaced memos that made Margaret laugh despite herself. In turn, she told him about her volunteer work at the community center, describing the knitting group she led and the friendships she had formed there. It was strange, she thought, how easy it was to talk to him now. They hadn't had a real conversation like this in years, and yet it felt natural, almost effortless. By the time dessert arrived, a decadent chocolate tort that Richard insisted they share, Margaret's earlier anxiety had melted away. She found herself savoring not just the rich flavors of the meal, but also the warmth of the moment. Sitting across from Richard in this elegant setting, surrounded by laughter and candlelight, she realized something important. She deserved to be treated well, not because of what she wore or how much money she had, but simply because she was human. And perhaps for the first time in a long time, she believed it. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Richard reached for her hand once more. "Ready?" he asked, his smile genuine and kind. Margaret nodded, returning the gesture, with a small but confident grin. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't face them alone. The days following the grocery store incident and their lunch at the Willow Room marked a subtle but significant shift in Margaret's life. For years, she had lived quietly, content to stay in the background while others took center stage. But now something inside her had awakened, a newfound sense of self-worth that refused to be ignored. It was as though the confrontation with the manager and Richard's unwavering support had cracked open a door she hadn't realized was closed. Slowly, tentatively, Margaret began stepping through it. One of the first changes came in her volunteer work at the community center. Before, she had always been hesitant to take on leadership roles, preferring instead to assist quietly from the sidelines. But now, inspired by Richard's words about standing up for herself, she decided to embrace her role as the leader of the knitting group more fully. She started organizing themed sessions, like Knit for Kindness, where participants made scarves and hats to donate to local shelters, and encouraged members to share their own stories during meetings. To her surprise, the group responded enthusiastically, praising her creativity and warmth. For the first time, Margaret felt truly seen, not just as someone who helped behind the scenes, but as a person with ideas worth sharing. At home, things between Margaret and Richard continued to improve. True to his promise, Richard made a conscious effort to prioritize their relationship. He cut back on late nights at the office, opting instead to spend evenings with Margaret. Sometimes they'd sit together in the living room, talking about their days or watching old movies. Other times he'd join her in the kitchen, chopping vegetables or stirring pots while she cooked dinner. These small moments may have seemed ordinary, but to Margaret, they were extraordinary. They reminded her of the early days of their marriage, when everything felt new and exciting. Richard also surprised her one weekend by suggesting they go on a short trip, a getaway to a nearby lake cabin. At first, Margaret hesitated, worried about the expense and whether it was practical. But Richard insisted, saying they both needed a break. The cabin turned out to be charmingly rustic, with creaky wooden floors and large windows that overlooked the water. They spent their days hiking along forest trails, skipping stones across the lake and simply enjoying each other's company without the distractions of daily life. One evening, as they sat side by side on the porch watching the sunset, Margaret turned to Richard and said softly, "I feel like I'm getting to know you all over again." "You're not the only one," Richard replied with a smile. "And I think I like this version of us even better." Back in town, news of the grocery store incident spread quickly, thanks in part to the whispers of curious shoppers who had witnessed Richard's confrontation with the manager. Some people praised Richard for standing up for his wife, while others criticized the manager for his lack of professionalism. The store's management team took notice too, and launched an internal investigation into the matter. Within weeks, the young manager was reassigned to a different branch, and the store implemented new training programs focused on customer service and empathy. Employees were encouraged to treat every shopper with kindness and respect, regardless of appearance or circumstance. Margaret returned to the store a few times after that, though she did so cautiously at first. Each visit felt like a test of sorts, a chance to see if anything had truly changed. To her relief, the staff greeted her warmly, apologizing profusely for what had happened and assuring her that such behavior wouldn't be tolerated moving forward. Margaret appreciated their efforts, though she couldn't help but notice how much easier it was to shop there now that everyone knew who she was, or rather, who her husband was. Still, she chose to focus on the positives, the friendly smiles, the genuine apologies, the renewed sense of belonging. As the weeks turned into months, Margaret found herself embracing life with a confidence she hadn't felt in years. She signed up for a painting class at the community center, something she had always wanted to try but never dared to attempt. On her first day, she arrived nervously, clutching a blank canvas and a set of brushes. By the end of the session, however, she was laughing alongside her classmates, marveling at the colorful mess they had created together. Her instructor called her work bold and expressive, and though Margaret laughed it off, she couldn't deny the pride she felt in seeing her creation come to life. Richard noticed the change in her too. "You seem happier," he remarked one evening as they sat together on the couch. "More alive." "I feel it," Margaret admitted, curling up beside him. "It's strange. I spent so long thinking I was supposed to blend into the background, but now I realize how much I missed by doing that. There's joy in being seen, Richard, in knowing you matter." Richard nodded thoughtfully, pulling her closer. "You've always mattered to me, Margaret. Always." Their journey wasn't perfect, of course. There were still moments of tension, days when old habits threatened to creep back in. But neither of them gave up. Margaret continued to push herself, out of her comfort zone, trying new things and rediscovering parts of herself she had forgotten. Richard, in turn, kept showing up, for conversations, for laughter, for quiet moments that spoke louder than words. Together, they built a stronger foundation for their marriage, one rooted in mutual respect and understanding. Looking back, Margaret realized that the grocery store incident had been more than just an embarrassing moment. It had been a catalyst. It had forced her to confront feelings of invisibility and inadequacy that she had buried deep inside. And while it had been painful at times, it had also given her something invaluable, a second chance to rewrite her story. This time, she vowed to live boldly, authentically, and unapologetically. Because everyone deserved to be seen, and Margaret Dawson was finally ready to step into the spotlight. Months had passed since the day Margaret was kicked out of the grocery store, and while life hadn't become perfect overnight, it had certainly transformed in ways she never expected. The ripple effects of that single incident continued to shape her world, nudging her toward a version of herself she barely recognized but deeply admired. Margaret's newfound confidence didn't just stay within the walls of her home or the confines of the community center. It spilled over into every corner of her life, touching relationships, routines, and even dreams she had long abandoned. One of the most noticeable changes was how Margaret carried herself. Gone was the woman who walked with her head down, avoiding eye contact and blending into the background. In her place stood someone who moved through the world with quiet assurance. She still wore her faded cardigans and comfortable jeans, but now they felt like a choice rather than a reflection of insecurity. When people greeted her on the street, she smiled warmly, meeting their gaze without hesitation. Strangers began commenting on how approachable she seemed, how kind her presence felt. It wasn't that Margaret had changed who she was at her core. She was still the same gentle, thoughtful person. But she no longer shied away from allowing others to see her fully. Her volunteer work at the community center blossomed into something far beyond knitting scarves for shelters. Inspired by the connections she'd made during Knit for Kindness, Margaret proposed starting a mentorship program aimed at helping women rediscover their strengths after difficult experiences. At first, she worried the idea might be too ambitious, but when she pitched it to the center's director, he immediately agreed, praising her vision and dedication. The program quickly gained traction, drawing participants from all walks of life: young mothers juggling responsibilities, retirees seeking purpose, and even teenagers navigating self-doubt. Margaret found joy in guiding these women, sharing stories of her own struggles and triumphs to remind them they weren't alone. Richard, too, underwent his own transformation. His promise to prioritize their marriage wasn't just lip service. He followed through consistently. He started attending some of Margaret's community events, sitting quietly in the back of the room as she led discussions or demonstrated techniques. Though he admitted he didn't understand half of what went on in the knitting circle, he loved watching Margaret shine. Their shared evenings became sacred rituals, whether it was cooking together, taking evening strolls, or simply sitting, side by side reading books. Richard often joked that spending more time with Margaret had taught him things about her he hadn't known in decades, like her secret love for jazz music or her uncanny ability to solve crossword puzzles faster than anyone else. The grocery store remained a regular stop for Margaret, though it no longer held any fear for her. Employees greeted her warmly, calling her by name and asking about her latest projects. Occasionally, customers would recognize her as the woman whose husband stood up to the manager and strike up conversations, thanking her for inspiring change. While Margaret appreciated the acknowledgement, she also reminded herself and sometimes others that standing up for oneself wasn't about titles or wealth. It was about believing you deserved respect, regardless of your circumstances. Word of Margaret's mentorship program spread throughout the town, earning her recognition at local events and even an invitation to speak at a regional conference on community empowerment. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of people, clutching her notes nervously, Margaret realized she had come full circle. Once invisible, she now commanded attention, not because she sought it, but because her authenticity resonated with others. Her speech was simple yet heartfelt, focusing on the importance of kindness, resilience, and finding strength in vulnerability. By the end, the audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet. As Margaret stepped off the stage, a young woman approached her, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "You've given me hope." That moment stayed with Margaret long after the conference ended. It reminded her why she had chosen to step out of the shadows, to show others that change was possible, even after years of feeling overlooked. She knew her journey wasn't unique. Countless people around the world faced similar struggles daily. But if sharing her story could inspire even one person to believe in themselves, then every challenge she'd endured had been worth it. As the seasons changed and autumn gave way to winter, Margaret reflected on how much her life had shifted. The once familiar ache of invisibility had been replaced by a sense of belonging, not just in her community, but within herself. She still encountered moments of doubt, of course. Everyone did. But instead of letting those doubts define her, She chose to acknowledge them and keep moving forward. That, she realized, was the true essence of courage. Not being fearless, but continuing despite fear. On Christmas Eve, Margaret and Richard hosted a small gathering at their home, inviting close friends and neighbors to celebrate the holiday together. The house buzzed with laughter and warmth as guests mingled, sipping hot cocoa and exchanging gifts. Margaret stood in the kitchen, watching everyone enjoy themselves, when Richard joined her. Wrapping an arm around her shoulders, he leaned down and whispered, "Look at you, Margaret. Look at everything you've built." Margaret smiled, leaning into his embrace. "We've built it together," she corrected gently. And she meant it. While her personal growth had been a journey of self-discovery, Richard's unwavering support had been the foundation upon which she stood. Together they had proven that love, respect, and understanding could overcome even the hardest challenges. As snowflakes began drifting lazily outside the window, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. Life would always have its ups and downs, twists and turns. But she knew one thing for certain. She would face whatever came next with her head held high, surrounded by people who saw her and cherished her for exactly who she was.